The champagne glass slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of our downtown penthouse with a sound that seemed to echo through every hollow space in my chest. Around me, our engagement party continued, laughter, toasts, congratulations from friends who believed they were witnessing the perfect love story. But I stood frozen in our kitchen, staring at my phone screen, reading the text that had just arrived from my fiancé's ex-girlfriend. Ask him about Sarah. Ask him about last Tuesday. I'm Emma Richardson, and until that moment, I thought I understood everything about love. Growing up in a progressive family in Denver, my mother a successful marketing executive, my father a respected architect, I'd been raised to believe that love was about finding your soulmate, that perfect person who would understand you completely and never hurt you. David and I had been that couple. The couple everyone envied. We'd met at a coffee shop in Georgetown during my junior year, and from the moment our eyes locked across that crowded cafe, I knew he was the one. The butterflies, the instant connection, the way he seemed to read my thoughts, it was everything the movies had promised. True love means never having to say you're sorry, I'd told my best friend Maya when she'd questioned some of David's behaviors early in our relationship. It was my favorite line from Love Story, and I'd built my entire understanding of romance around it. If you really loved someone, and they really loved you, there would be no conflict, no need for apologies, no messy human complications. For 3 years, I'd lived in that beautiful delusion. But standing there, surrounded by the debris of broken crystal and broken illusions, I felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with the glass. The text wasn't about infidelity, I'd discover later it was about a lie David had told about his past, something he thought would hurt me. But in that moment, facing the possibility that my perfect love story was built on foundations I didn't understand, I realized I knew nothing about love at all. The worst part wasn't even the potential betrayal. It was the recognition that I'd been living in a fantasy so complete, so disconnected from reality, that I couldn't tell the difference between genuine love and the romantic mythology I'd absorbed from culture, family, and my own desperate need to believe in fairy tales. Emma, what's wrong? David appeared beside me, his face flushed from champagne and the excitement of our announcement. He looked so innocent, so genuinely concerned, that for a moment I wondered if I was overreacting. Who's Sarah? I heard myself ask. The slight shift in his expression, a microsecond of something that might have been guilt or fear, told me everything I needed to know. Not that he was cheating, but that there were parts of his life, parts of himself, that he'd kept hidden from me. In my romantic worldview, this felt like the ultimate betrayal. She's someone from my past. I didn't tell you about her because I didn't want to hurt you. But if you loved me, really loved me, wouldn't you tell me everything? Wouldn't you want to share every part of yourself? Even as I said it, I could hear how unreasonable it sounded. But I'd built my entire understanding of love around the idea of complete transparency, total understanding, instant connection without effort or communication. That night, after our guests had gone home and we'd had our first real fight in 3 years, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and asking myself a question that terrified me. What if everything I believed about love was wrong? What if the fairy tale I'd been chasing, the soulmate who would understand me without words, the relationship without conflict, the love that required no work, was not just unrealistic but actually destructive? What if my pursuit of perfect love was preventing me from experiencing real love? I had no idea that this crisis would lead me to discover a completely different way of understanding relationships, one that would transform not just my engagement to David, but my entire approach to human connection. I had no idea that learning to say I'm sorry, really learning it, would be the beginning of the most authentic love I'd ever experienced. But first, I had to let go of everything I thought love was supposed to be. The weeks following our engagement party felt like living in a house where all the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. Everything looked the same from the outside, but I kept bumping into sharp edges I hadn't noticed before. I threw myself into what I called relationship repair mode, approaching our problems the same way I'd approached every challenge in my life, with research, determination, and the absolute certainty that there was a right answer I could find and implement. I read everything: relationship books, psychology articles, advice columns. I signed us up for couples communication workshops and suggested weekly relationship check-ins where we could discuss any issues before they became problems. I created elaborate systems for ensuring we maintained our connection, scheduled date nights, shared journals, even apps that sent us daily questions to keep us emotionally intimate. But every solution I tried seemed to make things worse. The communication exercises felt forced and artificial. David would dutifully participate, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. "Emma," he said one evening after I'd suggested we practice active listening techniques, "we're not broken. Why are you trying so hard to fix us?" "Because," I said, pulling out my phone to show him an article I'd bookmarked, "this study from Harvard says that couples who practice intentional communication are 67% more likely to report satisfaction in their relationships." He stared at me like I'd suggested we start speaking in code. "Since when do we need Harvard to tell us how to talk to each other?" Since I realized we don't actually know how to love each other, I thought but didn't say. The more I studied relationships, the more inadequate ours seemed. Every article pointed out flaws I hadn't noticed, communication patterns that were apparently toxic, signs of dysfunction I'd been blind to. We weren't practicing enough gratitude. We weren't maintaining enough independence. We weren't resolving conflict correctly. The breaking point came 6 weeks after the engagement party, during what was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway to Napa Valley. I'd planned every detail, the perfect restaurant, the scenic drives, the couple's spa treatment that would deepen our connection. Instead, we spent most of Saturday fighting about the GPS. "Turn left here," I said, reading from my carefully researched itinerary. "The GPS says to go straight," David replied. "But I read that this route has better views." "Emma, we're not making a documentary. We're just trying to get to lunch. I'm trying to make this special for us." By controlling every single detail of our lives? The fight escalated until we were sitting in a parking lot, both of us crying, while I tried to explain why I needed everything to be perfect and he tried to explain why my need for perfection was suffocating him. "I feel like I'm failing some test I don't understand," he said finally. "Like you have this checklist of what love is supposed to look like, and I keep disappointing you just by being myself." He was right, and that realization was devastating. I had been treating our relationship like a performance that needed to be optimized rather than a connection between two imperfect humans. That night, lying in our expensive hotel bed while David slept fitfully beside me, I finally admitted something I'd been avoiding. I didn't actually know what love was. I knew what movies and books and magazines said it should be, but I had no idea what it actually looked like in real life between two people who weren't fictional characters. Worse, my attempts to create the perfect relationship were destroying the good relationship we'd actually had. The next morning, over coffee at a cafe in St. Helena, David said something that would haunt me for weeks. "Emma, I love you, but I don't know if I can marry someone who's more in love with the idea of love than she is with me." We drove home in silence, both of us knowing that our engagement was hanging by a thread, but neither of us knowing how to fix something when we couldn't even agree on what was broken. I spent the next 2 weeks in a fog of confusion and desperation. I called my mother, who suggested we needed better communication. I talked to Maya, who thought David was being unreasonable. I even considered calling off the engagement entirely, convinced that if we were having problems, we must not be meant for each other. The idea that love might require work, that it might involve conflict and misunderstanding and the need to apologize and try again, this was so foreign to my romantic worldview that it felt like failure rather than growth. I was drowning in my own expectations, and I didn't even know it. That's when Maya mentioned her philosophy professor from college, someone who'd apparently revolutionized her understanding of relationships during a guest lecture series he'd given in Miami. "Emma," she said, "I think you need to talk to someone who understands that love isn't what we think it is." I had no idea that this suggestion would lead me to discover that everything I'd believed about love wasn't just wrong, it was the very thing preventing me from experiencing the real thing. I found Professor Peter Den through the University of Miami's philosophy department website, where his bio described him as a specialist in the philosophy of human relationships and the cultural construction of romantic love. His profile photo showed a man in his 50s with kind eyes and an approachable smile, someone who looked like he'd heard every relationship crisis imaginable and wasn't shocked by any of them. When I called his office, expecting to be told he was too busy to help a confused woman having a relationship crisis, his assistant surprised me by saying he was available for a consultation that very afternoon. Dr. Den makes himself available for these kinds of conversations, she explained. He believes philosophical insights shouldn't be locked away in universities. His office in Coral Gables was nothing like I'd expected from a philosophy professor. Instead of intimidating books and formal furniture, it was warm and inviting, with comfortable chairs and windows that looked out onto a small garden. Peter himself was even more approachable in person, wearing a casual button-down shirt and speaking with the kind of gentle authority that made you feel immediately at ease. "So," he said, settling into his chair with a cup of tea, "Maya tells me you're struggling with some questions about love. What's been troubling you?" For the next 20 minutes, I found myself pouring out the entire story, the engagement party, the perfect relationship that suddenly felt artificial, the unsuccessful attempts to fix what I couldn't even identify as broken. "I thought love was supposed to be easy," I finished. "I thought if you found the right person, everything would just work." Peter nodded thoughtfully. "Tell me, Emma, where did you learn that idea?" "Everywhere," I said, confused by the question. "Movies, books, songs. Everyone knows that when you find your soulmate, you just know." "Ah," Peter said, his eyes lighting up with something that looked like recognition. "You're describing what we call the romantic ideology. And you're absolutely right, it is everywhere. But here's the fascinating thing, this idea that love should be effortless and perfect? It's only about 250 years old." He stood up and pulled a book from his shelf, flipping to a page marked with several bookmarks. Before the mid-18th century, people didn't expect to be in love with their spouses. Marriage was about practical concerns, economic stability, family alliances, child-rearing. The idea that you should marry for passionate love, that you should have a soulmate who understands you completely, that love should never require effort, this is what historians call romanticism, and it's a relatively new invention. "But surely loving someone completely is good?" I asked. "That's exactly the question we need to examine," Peter said, settling back into his chair. "Let me share something with you from Dr. Eli Finkel's research at Northwestern University. He studied what he calls the all-or-nothing marriage and found that our current expectations for romantic partnerships are historically unprecedented. We expect our partners to be our best friends, our passionate lovers, our intellectual companions, our emotional support systems, our co-parents, and our spiritual guides. No human being in history has ever been asked to fulfill so many roles for another person." I felt something shift in my chest, not relief exactly, but the first hint that maybe my struggles weren't personal failures. "So what you're telling me," I said slowly, "is that my expectations might be unrealistic?" "I'm suggesting that the template you're using for love might be setting you up for disappointment," Peter replied. "Tell me, in your relationship with David, when something goes wrong, what's your instinct? To figure out what we're doing wrong and fix it. To communicate better, to understand each other more completely. And when that doesn't work, to try harder? Or to wonder if we're not meant for each other?" Peter smiled gently. "Emma, what if I told you that conflict in relationships isn't a sign that something's wrong, it's a sign that something's working? What if the problems you're experiencing aren't bugs in your relationship, but features?" He pulled out another book, this one filled with highlighted passages and sticky notes. Dr. John Gottman at the University of Washington has studied thousands of couples over decades. His research shows that successful couples don't avoid conflict, they learn to navigate it skillfully. In fact, couples who never fight often have the most fragile relationships because they've never learned to repair ruptures. "But shouldn't love mean never having to say you're sorry?" I asked, quoting my favorite line. Peter laughed, not mockingly, but with the warmth of someone who'd heard that line many times before. "That might be the most destructive sentence ever written about relationships. If you love someone, you're going to hurt them sometimes, usually without meaning to. And when you do, saying I'm sorry isn't a sign that your love is flawed, it's a sign that your love is mature. He leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. Emma, let me ask you something. In your pursuit of the perfect relationship, have you ever considered that you might be asking David to be someone he's not? That you might be loving an idealized version of him rather than the actual person? The question hit me like a physical blow because I knew, instantly and completely, that the answer was yes. What if, Peter continued gently, instead of trying to eliminate the messiness of love, you learn to embrace it? What if the goal isn't to find someone who never disappoints you, but to find someone worth being disappointed by, and learning to repair things when they go wrong? For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't expected, curiosity instead of panic. What would it look like to love David as he actually was, rather than as I thought he should be? Would you be interested, Peter asked, in exploring what love might look like if we abandoned the romantic fantasy and embraced something more realistic, and ultimately more satisfying? Sitting in that sunny office in Coral Gables, I realized I was ready to learn about love all over again. The first assignment Peter gave me was deceptively simple: go home and apologize to David for something, anything, without expecting him to apologize back. But what if I haven't done anything wrong? I asked. Emma, Peter said with a knowing smile, if you've been in a relationship for 3 years and you can't think of anything to apologize for, that might be part of the problem. The drive back to our apartment gave me 45 minutes to spiral through my resistance to this idea. Apologizing felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that I wasn't the understanding, supportive partner I'd always believed myself to be. But when I walked into our living room and saw David on the couch, looking exhausted and defeated, I realized Peter was right. In my pursuit of the perfect relationship, I'd been so focused on whether David was meeting my needs that I'd forgotten to consider whether I was meeting his. David, I said, sitting down beside him, I owe you an apology. He looked up, surprised. For what? For treating our relationship like a problem to be solved instead of a connection to be enjoyed. For making you feel like you were failing some test you didn't know you were taking. For being so afraid of conflict that I turned every disagreement into a crisis. I watched his shoulders relax in a way they hadn't in weeks. Emma, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Because I love you, and when you love someone, you take responsibility for the ways you've hurt them, even when you didn't mean to. What followed was the most honest conversation we'd had in months. David told me about feeling like he was walking on eggshells, afraid that any imperfection would send me into research mode. I told him about my fear that if our relationship required work, it meant we weren't meant for each other. I thought love was supposed to be effortless, I said. I thought you were supposed to love me as I am. He replied. We both laughed at the impossibility of those expectations. Over the following weeks, Peter introduced me to what he called a more mature philosophy of love. Instead of weekly sessions, we met monthly, with homework assignments that gradually shifted my understanding of relationships. Read this, he said during our second meeting, handing me a paper by Dr. Helen Fisher from Rutgers University. She's identified 3 distinct brain systems involved in love, lust, romantic attraction, and attachment. The butterflies and instant connection you felt with David? That's the romantic attraction system, and it's designed to fade after 18 to 24 months. The real question is whether you can build something deeper. Learning that the special feeling I'd built my entire relationship on was literally a temporary neurochemical state was both devastating and liberating. It meant David and I weren't broken, we were normal. But what comes after the butterflies? I asked. The choice to love, Peter said. Which is much more interesting than falling in love, because it requires intention, effort, and skill. He introduced me to research from Dr. Gary Chapman about love languages, showing me that people express and receive love differently. He shared Dr. Sue Johnson's work on attachment theory, helping me understand that my need for constant reassurance came from my own insecurity, not David's inadequacy as a partner. Most importantly, he taught me about what he called generous interpretation. When David does something that bothers you, Peter explained, you have a choice about how to interpret his behavior. You can assume the worst, that he's being thoughtless, or doesn't care about you, or you can assume the best, that he's tired, or stressed, or simply approaching the situation differently than you would. But what if I'm making excuses for bad behavior? That's the skill you need to develop, distinguishing between generous interpretation and enabling. Generous interpretation means giving someone the benefit of the doubt when their behavior is puzzling or mildly irritating. Enabling means making excuses for genuinely harmful behavior. The practice assignments were revelatory. When David left dishes in the sink, something that had always triggered my anxiety about him not caring about our shared space, I practiced thinking, he's probably exhausted from work instead of he doesn't respect me. When he forgot to call during his business trip, which I'd previously interpreted as evidence that I wasn't a priority, I practiced thinking, he's busy and assumes I know he loves me instead of he's taking me for granted. The most difficult assignment was learning to ask for what I needed directly instead of expecting David to read my mind. But shouldn't he know what I need if he loves me? I asked Peter. Emma, do you know what David needs without him telling you? I had to admit I didn't. Expecting someone to intuit your needs isn't romantic, it's a setup for resentment. Clear communication isn't the enemy of love, it's the foundation of love. Slowly, I began to see our relationship differently. Instead of a perfect harmony that required no effort, I started understanding it as a skill that we were both learning, a craft that required practice and patience and the willingness to fail and try again. The breakthrough came 3 months into this new approach. David and I had planned a quiet evening at home, but I'd had a terrible day at work and was feeling overwhelmed. In the past, I would have expected him to notice my mood and know exactly how to comfort me. When he didn't, I would have interpreted his obliviousness as evidence that he didn't really understand me. Instead, I said, David, I've had a really hard day, and I'm feeling overwhelmed. Could we maybe order takeout instead of cooking, and could you just hold me for a while? His face lit up with relief and gratitude. Of course. Why didn't you just say that? Because I thought you should know, I admitted. Emma, he said, pulling me into his arms, I love you, but I'm not a mind reader. And I don't want to be. I want you to tell me what you need so I can actually give it to you. That night, as we ate Thai food on the couch and watched terrible Netflix shows, I realized something profound. This felt more like love than all my perfect romantic fantasies ever had. Real love, I was learning, wasn't about finding someone who never disappointed you. It was about finding someone you could disappoint and repair things with, someone you could be imperfect with and still be cherished. The woman who had believed love meant never having to say sorry was learning that love actually meant being brave enough to say sorry first, and generous enough to forgive when others said it to you. 6 months later, I'm standing in the same kitchen where my understanding of love first shattered. But the woman holding a champagne glass, this time with steady hands, is someone I barely recognize. Not because I look different, but because I love differently. David and I are hosting a dinner party for the friends who attended our engagement celebration 8 months ago, but this time we're celebrating something more meaningful than a perfect love story. We're celebrating the choice to build a real relationship rather than chase a romantic fantasy. Speech. Speech. Maya calls out, raising her own glass. I look around at our friends, couples who I once envied for seeming so perfectly matched, single friends who I used to pity for not having found the one, and realize how much my perspective has changed. 8 months ago, I thought love was about finding someone who would never disappoint you, someone who would understand you completely without effort, someone who would make you feel like you were in a romantic movie every day. There are knowing laughs around the room. Everyone has believed some version of this fairy tale. I thought love was a feeling that just happened to you, and if you had to work at it, that meant you were doing it wrong. I thought saying I'm sorry in a relationship was a sign of failure. David squeezes my hand, and I see the understanding in his eyes. We both learned so much about what it means to choose each other daily. But here's what I've discovered, love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you decide to do, every day, with someone who's willing to do it back. It's not about never having to say sorry, it's about being brave enough to say sorry first, and generous enough to forgive when the other person needs to say it to you. The philosophy Peter taught me has become more than academic knowledge, it's become a living practice that has transformed not just my relationship with David, but my relationships with everyone in my life. I've learned to see my parents not as the perfectly loving couple I'd idealized, but as two imperfect people who've chosen each other for 40 years, through disappointments and misunderstandings and the daily work of building a life together. I've learned to see my friends not as supporting characters in my romantic story, but as complex individuals dealing with their own relationship challenges, worthy of the same generous interpretation I've learned to extend to David. Most importantly, I've learned to see myself not as someone who was failing at love, but as someone who was finally learning what love actually is. The research is clear, I continue, channeling the wisdom Peter has shared with me over these months. Dr. Robert Sternberg at Yale identified 3 components of love: intimacy, passion, and commitment. Passion fades, that's not a bug, it's a feature. But intimacy and commitment can grow stronger over time, if you're willing to do the work. I pause, looking at David, who's watching me with the kind of attention that used to make me feel pressured to be perfect but now makes me feel seen and accepted. The work isn't about fixing your partner or your relationship. It's about learning to love more skillfully, learning to interpret behavior generously, to communicate needs directly, to repair ruptures when they happen, and to choose each other again and again, especially when it's hard. After our guests leave and David and I are cleaning up together, he says something that stops me in my tracks. You know what I love most about us now? What? We're not trying to be perfect anymore. We're just trying to be real. He's right. The pressure to maintain a fantasy relationship has been replaced by the more satisfying challenge of building an authentic partnership. We fight sometimes, not the devastating conflicts I used to interpret as relationship failures, but the normal disagreements that arise when 2 independent people share a life. And we've learned to fight well, to repair quickly, to use conflict as information about what we need rather than evidence that we're incompatible. 3 months ago, I started a blog called Recovering Romantic, where I share what I'm learning about the difference between fairy tale love and real love. The response has been overwhelming, thousands of people hungry for a more realistic and ultimately more satisfying approach to relationships. I thought I was broken, one reader wrote. You helped me realize that I was just using the wrong instruction manual. That's exactly what Peter helped me understand. We're not failing at love, we're succeeding at a version of love that was never designed to work. Next month, I'm starting a support group for what I call romance recovery. People who want to learn to love more skillfully, who are ready to trade the beautiful lie of effortless love for the more complex truth of chosen love. The woman who once believed that love meant never having to say sorry now knows that love means being brave enough to say sorry first, wise enough to forgive quickly, and committed enough to keep choosing each other through all the messy, imperfect, utterly human moments that make up a real relationship. As David and I turn off the lights and head to bed, I think about how grateful I am that our perfect love story fell apart. Because in its place, we've built something better, a love that's not based on fantasy or feeling, but on choice and commitment and the daily practice of seeing each other clearly and choosing each other anyway. Real love, I've learned, isn't about never having to say sorry. It's about saying sorry when you need to, meaning it when you say it, and loving someone enough to keep trying to be better for them, and for yourself. And that kind of love? That's worth celebrating.